most progressive organisations such as the James Hutton Institute and most progressive farmers can really come together to say, actually, how do we make this work? How do we make it work commercially for our farm businesses? How do we make it work in a way which actually delivers real outcomes and real improvements to drive resilience and strength into farming systems? So it's a very exciting moment in time.
Welcome to our latest Hutton Highlights podcast. I'm Elaine Maslin, Media Officer here at the James Hutton Institute. Through our podcast, we bring you a glimpse into our world-leading research across food, energy and environmental security. Today we have special guest David Webster. David is Chief Executive of Linking Environment and Farming, usually known as LEAF. David is given the official welcome of this year's Arable Scotland event that we co-organise here at the Hutton's Balruddery Farm. We've also got Adrian James, Knowledge Exchange Manager for Cereals and Oilseeds in Scotland for AHDB, the Agriculture and Horticulture Development Board, and Dr. Ali Karley, an agroecologist here at the Hutton. Adrian and Ali both play key roles in making Arable Scotland happen. So we can crack on. We've put their bios in the show notes, so please do have a look. So to jump straight in, the theme of this year's Arable Scotland, which is on July the 2nd for your diaries, is Arable Farming in a New Era. Ali, could you tell us why you chose this theme, or the organising team chose this theme for this year's Arable Scotland, and what is the new era we're talking about?
Well, it really came about from discussions within the committee members who organised the event to reflect what we really see as a convergence of so many factors and pressures that farmers are facing in Scotland and further afield. So we've got the changing climate, which is bringing with it some unpredictable weather events, both in terms of extremes of too much water and too little water, amongst other things. We've got declining biodiversity that people are very concerned about how we can halt those declines and reverse them. Global events which put pressures through markets, both on supply chains and value chains. And alongside that, we've got policy reforms leading to agricultural reforms that are asking farmers to adhere to new targets. So it really feels like a moment in time where a lot is changing and the farming landscape is changing, and farmers are experiencing all these different factors. And so we needed to look forward and think, well, this is the new era already. How do we prepare for that? Or how do farmers operate within that? What we're trying to do with Arable Scotland is bring that down to what farming looks like, arable farming looks like now and into the future in Scotland. So how do these larger scale events impact on what farming practices that farmers use, what types of crops they can grow within these changing seasonal cycles, but also the risks around both risks of change, but risks of not changing the farming system. And recognising that there are a lot of difficult decisions that farmers need to make. They don't necessarily know how things are going to pan out. So that's the purpose of the event, is to try and facilitate that pathway by sharing knowledge and experience about people from different information sources.
David, welcome to Hutton Highlights, and thank you for opening Arable Scotland this year. LEAF has been involved in this arena for some time now, and so have you before joining LEAF, having been with Jordan Cereals on their journey and then ABF. Could you give us your perspective on this new era and what's happening?
I'm absolutely delighted, and I'm really delighted to be coming up to the James Hutton Institute. This is one of my first engagements since taking over as Chief Executive of LEAF here in September last year, following the sad death of Caroline Drummond, who I'm sure will be known to many people. So LEAF as an organisation, just briefly, was founded in 1991, linking environment and farming, and this sort of growth of understanding around the need for commercial farms to adopt practices that directly relate to environmental outcomes, I think has been a very slow but progressive journey over that time, these preceding 30 years. And in the last 5 years, I think everyone would recognise the massive transition in understanding and recognition that these issues are directly related to one another. And similarly, Jordan's Cereals, where I worked before, were founded by two brothers in the 1970s, both of whom invested huge amounts of money in their own supply chain operations directly to stem the loss of biodiversity on farmland over that period. So again, a very progressive, far-sighted view. And I completely agree with what Ali has just said. It's becoming abundantly clear that there are really, really significant challenges which are not only having a consequence in terms of environmental decline, as was previously the case, but directly now placing a threat over farming systems and the commercial operation of farming businesses. And I think the winter we've just had is a very good case study in point. And if we believe what the climate scientists are telling us, which I certainly do, actually we are about to head into a period where the volatility in weather patterns, which we're currently experiencing, is only going to become more of a consistent theme. We have to change how we think about managing our operations. If we do not, we will be compelled to do so by legislation. So I think there's a real moment in time where the most progressive organisations such as the James Hutton Institute and most progressive farmers can really come together to say, actually, how do we make this work? How do we make it work commercially for our farm businesses? How do we make it work in a way which actually delivers real outcomes and real improvements to drive resilience and strength into farming systems? So it's a very exciting moment in time.
I guess something to address in that is there's almost big brush challenges, but when you look at different farms, they're going to have different things that they need to adopt. So that understanding of what works for some doesn't work for others, is that something you're involved in, and how do you see Arable Scotland kind of helping with that?
Absolutely. And I think this is a really important point that you're touching on there, Elaine, and because actually it's no good environmental organizations preaching on high and telling people that there are quick fixes to these issues. Very often there aren't, and the need for action and the need for ownership of that action has to sit with individual farmers around the decisions they make within their own business. You can't impose these things. There's a big philosophical cultural journey that we're on now, where we're trying to bring the wider farming community to understand the sense in looking at some of these more progressive practices like cover cropping, etc., and thinking about what that could mean on their farm and the benefits it can give them. I mean, I think that's the other thing. So it's really trying to take the ownership of the message into the farming community and give the farming community its own voice around what this looks like. I think that's absolutely crucial. You can't affect change without bringing people with you. So I'm a very firm believer that. And organisations like the AHDB have been doing this sort of direct farm engagement for many years. And I think what's so delightful is to see so many organisations now coming together with similar objectives around trying to understand how do we determine what the best interventions are that we can make on a range of different farms, and how do we encourage farm businesses to adopt those, not because they're being told to, but because they see the benefit of doing so.
Yeah, and understanding the different options that are available to them. One thing isn't going to work for everybody.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely agree with that.
So Adrian, welcome to you also. How do you reflect on this idea of already being in a new era from an AHDB perspective? Are you seeing more farms trying different approaches to what they have in the past?
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. I think we are in a new era. It's plain to see. There's an argument to say that farming is always changing and has always changed. And farmers are brilliant at adapting, because they have to adapt, because no two farms are the same and no 2 years will be the same. But we are seeing a period now of rapid change. We're in this race to net zero, which the government's realised that they need farmers on board to do that. Farmers are sort of being steered down that road. So there is change, and there are farmers out there who are embracing the change, as always, but there are farmers out there they're not lagging behind, but they're more traditional. They know what works for them. Ultimately, to continue to farm, you need to continue to make money. They're seeing their margins shrink. Their inputs are more expensive. The risks that they're taking financially are greater. So they want to be confident in what they're doing will return them some money so that they continue to farm next year. So it's not an easy situation to be in. So trying to encourage farmers to try new ideas in a time of change, for many, can be difficult. Some embrace it, as always, but some don't. So it's about taking little steps and trying to bring more farmers on that journey, because they are under pressure, and the farmers, they know they're under pressure. They're being squeezed by not just the government, but by their suppliers and the people that they supply to. They all want their piece of the pie. So it's not an easy time to farm, but it can be an exciting time to farm, because there's always opportunities. It's just about bringing those opportunities together. And that's basically what Arable Scotland on the day is trying to do. It's trying to encourage farmers, to trying to help them, trying to show them, identify some opportunities that perhaps can help them along that journey.
I think David touched on regen and your knowledge exchange up here in Scotland, but do you see, Adrian, differences between regen adoption here in Scotland compared to England, and what are the differences and challenges?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think regenerative agriculture in Scotland is different perhaps to England. What is regenerative agriculture? You know, I know there are the 5 principles, but they don't always work on each individual farm. That's the beauty of farming. Farming is, you know, it's individual. You have to make what works for you. So within regenerative agriculture, there has to be scope for flexibility. And we don't have as kind a climate perhaps as some of the arable farmers down south in terms of cover cropping. We don't have a weather window or a time window in Scotland to establish cover crops every autumn successfully. Some years they establish absolutely brilliantly. Other years it's a complete waste of time. Often you don't know when that is going to be until you get there. So every year can be a bit of a gamble, which again, it's about risk and reward. So you have to try and adapt and find what works. In Scotland, it's about being able to be willing to take the risk, accepting that some years the risk will fail, but also about not being rigid in your system and maybe finding a system that is perhaps slightly off the full regenerative principles, but is still regenerative. You know, you don't have to follow those 5 principles rigidly to make a difference.
What do they need to help adaptation and taking up measures like this? Can government play a role? See, we're playing a role in what we're doing with Arable Scotland, but what else can help?
Government certainly can play a key role. The Scottish government are making it plain. We're going through the new policy is coming out at the moment. And hopefully by 2027, we will be on that road. And I think it's quite clear that they will be emphasising to farmers that they want to be focused on more regenerative farming in some way or other. And that's to all farmers. That's not just necessarily arable farmers. That will include all farmers. So I think they can play a key role. Government, they have to understand that farming isn't a rigid set of principles. Look at the weather we've just had this winter. And then 2 years ago, we had the driest summer in Scotland. So you can make a plan in farming, but the plan has to be fluid. You can't just have a plan and fix it to that plan and it works. The plan has to be fluid, and governments have to accept that. And they have to put that into their plan themselves to allow for global events, climate events. There isn't just one cap fits all, unfortunately.
So, David, there's obviously a lot of pressures for change coming from different directions, government, weather. Do you see other pressures coming from elsewhere as well?
Yes, actually, Adrian touched on some of these points just now, actually, but I think clearly the pressure that's building within the system and the pressures that are building on farmers, food supplies are not simply about the supply of food in isolation. They're also deeply connected into geopolitical factors. So when one looks at the war in Ukraine, it's probably the most obvious example there, where the limitations of supplies of fertilizers, etc., the spike in grain prices, it had an enormous impact upon farming businesses across the whole of the UK. And interestingly, coming into LEAF, so LEAF as an organisation has 3 aspects to its work, one of which is standard setting, one is peer-to-peer learning, and then the other is an educational arm. And on the standard setting side of things, every time I've been out to a demonstration farm within our network, one of the 40 odd demonstration farms within our network, I've asked them, why do you do this? Why is LEAF important to you? And the consistent answer has been that managing environmental outputs in the context of my farm business helps me save money, particularly in these sort of conditions which we're in now, where there are volatile spikes in input costs. Many of these farmers use data to help inform them down to the individual field, the cost of, say, for example, drilling that field, managing the field, the likelihood of them getting a particular level of yield back off the field. And often they're focused much more upon the profitability of their crop output than the yield output necessarily. So the two things don't have to directly correlate with one another. I definitely think we're entering a world where prices will mirror geopolitical conditions. We're seeing more erratic weather conditions. We're going to see more erratic pricing. We're seeing more erratic pricing. Having greater resources available as individual farmers to be able to manage your own business in such a way as you've got greater strength and understanding of how to smooth those costs out or how to mitigate costs wherever possible, I think is hugely to the advantage of growers. The other thing which I'll just add to that as well is the pressure which will be building more broadly through the wider supply chain. And I think this we're starting to see on 2 levels. So already, for example, on the LEAF mark side of things, on our standard side of things, Tesco and Waitrose and Asda have specified this as a global standard for their fresh produce supply chain. chains. So we're working very closely with them now. So there's an increasing pressure coming through from the retailers to have governance control around, management controls around specific aspects of arable food production. And then secondly, on the other side, I think we're about to see a growth in products coming to market from the financial services sector as well, which will incentivize those growers that seek to adopt these type of framework sustainability standards within their management operations. And again, that will grant access, one would expect, to preferential rates on loans, on overdrafts, on hopefully insurance and things like this. And I think that's a trend which we're going to see coming in. So I think there's a kind of stick and carrot at play here. Legislation, demand from supply chain for greater accountability will be mirrored by incentives at the other end to encourage farmers to adopt some of these framework standards. Basically, I think as a mechanism for the whole supply chain being able to comply with rapidly changing legislation, which is coming through across all parts of the Western world now, are making very significant changes to legislative frameworks to drive engagement around linked to net zero, exactly as already been said.
And what are some of the things that you can do on the ground to support farmers to try these new approaches?
I think the point that's been very well made by both Ali and Adrian already, actually, is that some of these new approaches, there's quite high risk if you're a farmer to adopt something quite radical, and that risk is high in an arable system in the UK. I mean, if you're starting to talk about, say, subsistence farmers in sub-Saharan Africa or in sort of parts of Asia, the risk of change and your crop failing as a consequence of that change is very high. So organisations like LEAF, one of the things which we do is we do a lot of peer-to-peer learning backed activity where we work with innovation centres such as the James Hutton Institution, which was one of our first innovation centres. We take the known best practice from academia and put it onto farms, and then we have a network of 40 demonstration farms, and we connect LEAF members into what's going on those demonstration farms through a peer-to-peer learning framework to say, look, this is what it looks like in application, this is how the farm's done it. And actually, typically, in my experience, the farming community farmers learn best from other farmers. Farming is a very practical, pragmatic occupation, and what tends to happen if you get farmers in the field looking at the outputs, they'll start to ask all the pragmatic questions about, well, how did you actually make that happen? What was the impact on your bottom line? How did it work? And I think that this accelerating this peer-to-peer learning exchange, I think, is really, really important as we go through the journey towards net zero. So we start to understand the art of the possible and what can work, what can be done, what can't be done, what hasn't worked. I think these things it's just so important. But that's not down to any one part of that network. It's got to be the whole network coming together and facilitating knowledge exchange and learning and communication freely.
Yeah, and Arable Scotland is all about that knowledge sharing between research, practice.
Absolutely. And
providing that platform for people to discuss and share some of these challenges. Ali, can you give us a flavour of what is in store at this year's Arable Scotland?
Yeah, so as I think you mentioned right at the beginning, this is our 6th year. And so we're still a relatively young event. And I have to say that there hasn't been 2 events that have been exactly the same as each other. We try and evolve the programme of activities year to year. Something that has been consistent throughout is the plots and exhibits where we showcase latest research and industry, product and learning. And our very successful Arable Conversations, which is where we have panel discussions about issues that are live and important to the arable sector in the year at any one time. But this year we've really tried to expand and extend what we have on offer, and we've added some new for us activities which we hope will give some practical experience to people who are attending, and also highlight research that's maybe not ready to go into practice now, but it's in the pipeline and is relevant to the arable sector. So the focus this year, as we said, is on arable farming in a new era, but what makes the farming system resilient to these factors, these changes that we've talked about between us already so far. So improving farm resilience of the farm business, but also particularly looking at after the soil and adapting to this changing weather and the changing regulatory landscape. Last year's event, we had new for the first time. We experimented with having working farm machinery demonstrations, and these were really well received. So we've expanded the range of demonstrations this year as well. But new for this year, we have hands-on workshops. These are short workshops which will give practical insights into various aspects that contribute to farm resilience and farming in a new era. And these include things like looking at soil quality assessment, how farmers can adopt integrated pest management approaches and maximise their benefits, And then this is particularly important as regulatory changes mean that some of the key ingredients for crop protection have been disappearing from the market. And we're also going to be looking at how crops are assessed in research and breeding trials to give an idea to attendees of what kind of traits and characteristics that we're looking for in crop improvement, and also how we actually assess them. Also new for this year, we're going to have some short seminars, and these are from scientists or experts in their field about research that's coming close to application, particularly looking at things like novel crops and minor crops and how they might have potential in an arable setting in Scotland, about how we might make our soils more resilient to extreme weather, and also look at who's buying crops and how the end users of cereal crops are supporting research into arable farming sustainability. And this is going to include some insights into the barley industrial training network that we host at the James Hutton Institute in our International Barley Hub. This is called the Baritone Network of PhD Studentships. So it's quite a varied and exciting programme, we hope. For those who want to stay a bit longer at the end of the day, we're going to finish off with a tour of the James Hutton Institute's Centre for Sustainable Cropping, which is a long-term rotational experiment looking at the use of integrated and regenerative farming practices in an arable rotation, which we think will be of interest to quite a number of people. We hope that there's lots on the programme that will appeal to many different people, and please come and join us on the day.
Yeah, and this is all on one day, July the 2nd.
Yes, we're packing in a lot, and as we say, we're really hoping that there's something for everybody there.
It does sound absolutely fascinating. I'm really looking forward to it. It's really, there's so much to cover. It's going to be great.
A big thing that's been mentioned or touched on is the carbon and biodiversity markets and some of that information overload. It's obviously an area that is a big challenge, and I imagine it could be quite overwhelming for many. Is this part of this year's event?
I think carbon and all that goes with it is going to be a topic for not just this event. I think it was a topic at last year's event, and I think it will be a topic at events going forward for some time. So yes, it will be spoken about at this year's event. Within AHDB, we're starting a new project at the moment called Carbon Baselining. It's a pilot project across the UK, England, Scotland and Wales. We're looking for a baseline of carbon on farms. So the whole carbon topic is a massive topic. Governments are obviously interested in it because they need to be. They've committed to international targets, and the only way they can meet those targets is with agriculture involved. So governments have to incentivize to farmers a way and a means of capturing carbon. And then for farmers, there's also a way to look at it. Well, how do I monetize that as the farmer, and what can I do, not just to monetize it, but what can I do to improve the environment? But then if you want to monetize it, how is the best way? And not only that, the agricultural suppliers are involved, the processors are involved, because they will have targets to meet. So it's quite a vast topic, and not something you can nail all the answers down in a day. But yeah, it's something that will certainly take up an awful lot of time for farmers going forward.
So that's one of our two arable conversations that we've got going on. Can you tell us a bit more about the second one?
So yeah, we have one of the conversations is looking at natural capital and how that could be managed and improved to benefit farm businesses. And the other one, we're really taking a broad look at what makes resilience in Scottish farming conditions. So thinking beyond the soil. So soil is obviously part of it. It's the key, it's the substrate in which crops are grown. And there's been a lot of focus on soil health and looking after our soils, quite rightly. But actually, we need to build on that, the other aspects of resilience within the farming system. We see that the farms have been exposed to increasing variable conditions, both in terms of extreme weather conditions, but also fluctuations in global events, geopolitical events that affected their supply chain, the values of farming inputs, and also the value of what the crop products that they produce. So what we're looking at is what makes farm resilience. This is also looking at how the soil and the crop management practices that are showing benefits for coping with these extreme variations in these factors, also associated changes in pests and diseases that are occurring alongside the change in climate. We're also looking more broadly at what creates resilience in terms of social and mental health resilience, and we've got a representation from the organisation FarmStrong on the discussion panel.
I think that's a very important topic at this stage. We're in this vast state of change and flux. We've talked about the risks being great, and farming can be a lonely profession. And sadly, at this point, still male dominated, and men are not the best at talking about what's going on in their heads. And we do see a high percentage of, sadly, suicides. So I think the Farm Strong movement is vital in this day and age now, when we're seeing all these risks and everything else. So I think it's something that, you know, we all need to be mindful of. We all need to perhaps know a bit more about, so that as we're people that connect with farmers, because some of these farmers won't speak to people on a day-to-day basis. A lot of these events, yes, they're coming to see what's going on, but it's also getting them away from the day-to-day pressures of the farm. So I think, you know, we need to also be mindful of the social requirement. We are social animals after all. I think we almost have a social responsibility to have something on the agenda like that at almost every event, certainly every big event, so that, you know, you just don't know who you're going to save. That's the way I look at it, because you'll never see the results, so you just never know who you're going to help.
Thank you, Adrian. That's an important point to make. Maybe for those who haven't been up to Balruddery before, including David, we look forward to welcoming you. Ali, could you tell us some of the projects we're doing at Balruddery that they might find interesting out with Arable Scotland?
Absolutely. So a lot of the research that we do at Balruddery Farm and at the Institute is going to be exhibited or demonstrated at Arable Scotland. And we have a large number of field plots presented by James Hutton Institute and colleagues and collaborators. And they cover quite a huge breadth of research and industry relevant topics. And these includes our latest research on cover crops that's already come up as being definitely a useful farming practice in terms of sustainable and regenerative approaches, but one that can be quite tricky in Scottish growing conditions. So we're looking at which species give the best results for establishment and for soil protection. We've got exhibits which showcase our research looking at soil cultivation management across crop rotations. This relates to our long-term tillage platform at Greaves House at the Institute Farm, and also our Centre for Sustainable Cropping, which is now in its third 6-year arable rotation cycle, where we integrate a package of reduced input, regenerative and integrated pest management practices into one package and test them out in relation to standard industry practice. So that's going to be demonstrated at Arable Scotland, but there's also an optional tour to go and see that at the end of the day. We also have latest information about our cereal germplasm resources and the genetic characterization and phenotyping work that we're doing and how they're feeding into the development of more resilient crop varieties, and also taking a look at new crops such as hemp and crops that are being revived such as flax. And this very much links into other initiatives at the Institute. So, for example, I've already mentioned the International Barley Hub, which is going to be showcased through our baritone programme. And off farm, we also have staff who are working on various projects looking at the valuation of natural capital, which is the subject of one of our arable conversations, and how that can work within a farm business context.
Adrian, could you tell us a bit about what AHDB is doing too? What will you be doing at the event, and what will you be looking out for at Arable Scotland?
I always enjoy Arable Scotland. It's always a day to get out in the field and talk to our levy payers, have a chat with them about how their season's going, what they think their harvest is going to be like. You know, not always a good harvest, but you know, it is what it is. But also on the day, there's an opportunity for our levy payers to talk to some of our other AHDB staff that they wouldn't necessarily always get the opportunity to. My colleague Julie Clark will be on site. She heads up our farm bench team. So if levy payers want to talk to her about farm bench and what that involves. We will also have Emma Willis coming up from her soils team. Emma's going to be in a soil pit all day talking about soil stuff. She enjoys that sort of thing. And then we will also have our systems director up, Mike Gooding. He'll be on hand to talk to farmers and growers and anybody involved in the agricultural industry, really, about any questions that they might have about what AHDB is doing, what they would like to see from AHDB. It's a chance for them to make their comments face to face, and it's a chance for them to talk to the people who they don't normally get the chance to. So yeah, I always enjoy the day. It goes very fast, and we need some nice weather.
Completely agree. And also, I think the key thing is about this opportunity to speak with farmers, not just AHDB members, but a lot of the research that we do, both individually as an organisation, James Hutton Institute, but also in partnership with organisations like LEAF, AHDB, and some of our sponsors like Scottish Society for Crop Research, SRUC, and Safari. We work with farmers out on their farms, and in a way Arable Scotland is a really nice opportunity for us to give something back, because they've collaborated with us and given us their time and contributed to the research, and it's a way of letting them see some of the results of that research.
Yeah, and I think Ali's right there in what she says, but it's also a great way for farmers to come together. Peer-to-peer knowledge is a great thing. David's already mentioned it. You can't put a price on peer-to-peer learning.
I completely agree, and we learn something too.
Every day is a school day, but yeah, I mean, I've been involved in Arable Scotland. This will be my third one. Every one has been better than the one before.
So I'm going to start winding up there. I'm going to come back to David. You're opening Arable Scotland for us, so you could close our Arable Scotland podcast for us. What will you be hoping for from this year's event?
As I've said before, I'm absolutely delighted to have been asked to open the event, and I'm really looking forward to it. I'm really looking forward to meeting farmers from across the Arable Scotland network. I'm looking forward to seeing the James Hutton Institute. It's a place I've wanted to visit for a very, very long time, so I'm really looking forward to looking around. I'm also really intrigued by these questions around, well, what do the more novel practices like regenerative farming, cover cropping, soil structure management look like in the context of Scottish agriculture? Because the issues that are facing growers in Scotland are not the same as those at the south of the border, as Adrian has already alluded to. And I think often there's a lot to be learnt in terms of understanding what's not possible as well as what is possible, because the more you can understand about the parameters in which you can influence change, the more an organisation like LEAF can go away and say, okay, well, we know that if we pull this lever over here, we can get a good outcome in terms of driving environmental engagement in a particular area, but that's not going to be possible in these different contexts. So on the other extreme, for example, some of the organisations I work with are big salad producing businesses which will have operations which will span right the way from Ely in the east of England down to Africa and Senegal in Africa. And so when you start to see on the extremes of the weather patterns that these farm businesses are exposed to, and of course Scotland is on the opposite extreme of that, you start to form a view as to, okay, what does the art of the possible start to look like? So what does sustainability mean in all these different contexts, and therefore how do the standards that we're working to develop and the peer-to-peer learning that we're trying to facilitate, how can we face into optimum solutions in the context of the environment which is there? So I'm really, really looking forward to the event. It sounds amazing. I can't wait to see the live machinery demonstrations and to hear firsthand about the science, which I always find so utterly fascinating in terms of what's developing. So I'm deeply grateful for Adrian and Ali giving me the opportunity to come along, and I'm really looking forward to the 2nd of July. I think it should be a fantastic day.
Thank you very much. So that's our time up. I want to thank our guests, David Webster from LEAF, Adrian James from AHDB, and Ali Karley from the Hutton. Thank you also to the listener. We hope you enjoyed this glimpse into some of the discussion that you can get involved in at this year's Arable Scotland. We're also grateful to our sponsors and supporters, Safari, SRUC, KWS, the Scottish Whisky Association, and the Scottish Society for Crop Research, who helped make this event happen. You can find links to the event and how to attend and more in the show notes. We hope to see you there. Do like and share the podcast, and of course subscribe to us on your podcast platform of choice. Just search Hutton Highlights Podcast. Until next time, stay safe.